It strikes me that in the initial weeks, months of Russia's invasion, that there was a sense of, oh wow, war could happen with NATO at any moment. That if Russia's invasion of Ukraine is successful, then we'll have this hostile actor with lots of hubris at NATO's doorstep. It already is, of course, in the Baltic states. But this will then require us to urgently rush out and just recapitalize our forces. So the Poles, instead of participating, for instance, in the future European tank, go out and buy Korean because the Koreans can get them tanks sooner rather than later. But now that Russia has sort of been bogged down in a war of attrition, as Paul's report outlines, it strikes me that there's a bit more time to make the right investments, be a little bit more strategic in how NATO and Europeans are going about the recapitalization of their forces, and also about how we are postured. So do we have time? That is sort of one question. Then the other aspect of this, you all have brought up Ukraine. I've sort of not talked about what is the real elephant in the room, the Ukrainian counteroffensive. But it strikes me from just a broader strategic perspective that Russia is going to have to be consumed with the war, or the threat, quote unquote, posed by Ukraine to Russia holding what it has indefinitely, as long as this war is going on. And so hence the U.S. providing and Europeans providing assistance to Ukraine in some ways is fixing Russian forces on Ukraine as opposed to the broader NATO threat. So that's sort of two different threads here. Paul, maybe I could bring you back in to address either of those topics, but in anything else that you heard from John and Lisa's presentations.
Yeah, I think those two topics are linked. Do we have time? And I do think that Russia, given the magnitude of their losses, the fact that they're embroiled in Ukraine, they're under heavy sanctions, they're finding ways to circumvent them increasingly, but it's somewhat of an unstable supply chain. And their economy has managed to maintain a reasonably stable GDP, and they are mobilizing their defense industry as well. I do think, though, that they're going, as long as the war continues on its current track with a substantial number of forces engaged in southeastern Ukraine, for the foreseeable future, it will be difficult for Russia to do more than to sustain its operations, at least until it manages to solve some of its defense industrial capacity limitations. And there's also a will issue and a manpower issue that goes along with that, for them to really be able to develop their forces in a way that restores to some degree the threat that existed prior to the invasion. Now, that I want to also tie this in with what Lisa said. Russian military has a lot of capabilities that have not been used in Ukraine, and I should have been a little clearer when I talked about whether Russia constitutes a continuing threat to Ukraine. From a conventional standpoint, from the kinds of scenarios that were discussed previously the last few years about like a bull rush into the Baltics or some other similar nature across the Suwalki Gap, those would probably be fairly challenging for Russia over the near term. But they have a lot of other capability that hasn't really been used. They have naval forces. They've increasingly increased their ability to project power using their naval forces to greater distance, including both ISR as well as strike. Severo-dense submarines, for example, which are extremely quiet and have long-range land attack capabilities. Their Air Force is still largely intact, mostly a fourth-generation force, but they're developing new weapon systems, new fifth-generation systems as well. They have new designs for the ground forces, which haven't really been developed simply because of the cost factors, but over time, if they decide to go into a more modernized force as the way forward post-Ukraine, then you could see them betting more heavily over time on things like the Armata tank, the Boomerang, and some of the more advanced systems. They've learned a lot about how to conduct a long-range precision strike campaign in Ukraine, despite the fact that it hasn't achieved that much strategic effect as of yet. One doesn't mean that it's not a potentially very potent set of systems that Russia could develop. One thing they did there was, rather than relying so much on their high-end attack systems that they entered the war with, Caliber, KH-101, and Iskander, they've gone to a more balanced mix of strike systems, more sustainable, lower cost, perhaps less capable, not enough of them to actually achieve the kinds of strategic effects they were hoping for, but those are lessons learned that they'll probably take back with them eventually as well. And I'll close by just saying that there's a lot of debate about how long it will take for Russia to reconstitute its forces. We touched on that earlier. And there's a lot of numbers thrown out, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. But I think that ignores a basic question, which is, what kind of force is Russia going to rebuild? Will it try to go to a higher end, multi-domain force to try to leverage some of the technical capabilities that it's used and is seen used against it in Ukraine? I think Shoigu, I can't remember the precise date, a few months back, indicated they're looking to expand the size of the force to field a force of 1.5 million strong, which sort of implies that they're planning for a more protracted campaign where they're going to need more sustainable personnel and larger amounts of weapon systems and the ability to produce them at a sustainable pace to maintain operations and ammunition supplies and so forth. So it's a difficult thing to project until you answer that fundamental question.
Right, and also Russia now being on sort of a war economic footing, really focusing its defense industrial production or its industrial production on defense. You know, if the fighting sort of crawls, or if we do find ourselves in a stalemate situation, that Russia will have that defense industrial capacity to sort of keep producing, and will it sort of throttle back or just continue, I think becomes a real question.
Can I add one more thing?
Yes, please.
I think one of the things we also should take into account is Russia's outreach to Iran and North Korea, coupled with an already fairly well-developed relationship with China. For the first time, we're seeing the war sort of promote some of the things that have been of some concern to U.S. strategists and policy planners, which is the potential for an authoritarian axis of some form. It's easy to overstate that threat, and the relations between Russia and all of these countries are still limited by various factors, but it does seem to be driving these powers to cooperate more closely. I think the big wild card, as Lisa and John both mentioned, is China. They've been holding back on the extent to which they're willing to help Russia to improve its capabilities and to obtain more advanced weapon systems and technology. Although they have done quite a bit more than some people may realize, but they're still constrained by their desire to maintain their economic ties with the West. And that continues to act as a major limiting factor on Russian-Chinese relationships, which otherwise are being propelled closer together by a variety of forces.